So today we have a panel to discuss the relationship between the press and the presidency, as President Joe Biden is now new to office. As Scott pointed out, my name is JD. I'm a PCLI board member here and chair of the Education Committee. And while I have not covered the White House myself, I'm familiar with how executive branches have tried to control the message here on Long Island. My day job, I'm the assistant news director at WSHU Public Radio. Joining us here right now is Yamiche Alcindor. She's a White House correspondent for PBS NewsHour. You might have seen her on MSNBC today as a political contributor. She started here on Long Island at Newsday. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be back, obviously virtually, but I got my start in Long Island working for Newsday, made a couple really good friends, including Bill and Olivia from Newsday. So I'm so excited to be here.
Well, you're home after all. So, but you started covering President Donald Trump in 2017, and looking at the big picture, how did Trump and his press officers try to control the message?
Well, I think the first thing I should say, I started covering him in the summer of 2015 for the New York Times. I wasn't a White House correspondent yet, but that was when I started going to his rallies. And started really understanding who he was, because I had never covered him as an entertainment story or anything before that. And you could see from the very beginning, when he was then candidate Trump, that he was someone who was going to use the media as his opposition, that we were going to be part of his foil. At the time, he was attacking Katie Tur from NBC regularly. Part of his stump speech was attacking the media. So we see politicians often talk about jobs or about healthcare or about immigration or about the policies, but his was a campaign that was really about personality and about being a victim and about seeing who was good and who was bad, and he put the media in the bad category. So fast forward to becoming a White House correspondent for PBS NewsHour. The White House was a place that was really hostile to reporters. The president tried to circumvent talking to reporters by going on Twitter, by going on Facebook and social media to try to directly talk to people, oftentimes putting out disinformation, things that were lies and that were not true. And we also saw a White House press team in a number of White House press secretaries who didn't want to brief the media daily, who didn't want to do the work of the American people, which is what they were sent to do, which is give us information. Instead, they wanted to, again, attack us. So part of trying to control the message was about beating up on the messengers.
We're going to talk about all of that, Trump and how presidencies before him tried to capitalize on the 24-hour news cycle, social media, and, as you put out, misinformation. But I just want to make sure everyone on the call knows that they can post questions in the chat for today's panelists, or tweet us at PCLI. We'll have a Q&A at the end of the program, and a recording of this panel will be available on PCLI.org. Dr. Meena Bose is with us. She's the Executive Dean for Public Policy and Public Service Programs and Director of the Peter S. Kalikow Center for the Center of American Presidency at Hofstra University. Meena, just say hi, give everyone a wave so they can find you.
Yeah, sure. Hi, JD. Thanks for having me. Hi, Yamiche. Hi, Jim. Glad to be on the panel.
And Jim Klurfeld is here. He just retired from Stony Brook University. He was a professor of journalism, teaching a course about the relationship between press and presidency. And Jim was the vice president and editor of the editorial pages at Newsday, with nearly 40 years at the paper, 10 of those covering the Carter and Reagan administrations in D.C. Jim, give everyone a wave.
Nice to see everybody.
Thank you. Professors, so Yamiche's experience covering Trump's White House with difficult press secretaries was extreme, but how strange was this behavior for an administration? Meena?
Well, I think without a doubt, the Trump presidency, as has been written about and discussed, broke norms, traditions, practices. We can see now that there was an article that was came out, I think yesterday or the day before, about how the Biden White House is returning to the custom of having the senior reporter, right, say thank you to the White House press secretary, and it's gone from thank you. And then Jen Psaki said great and exited the conference, right? But basically ensuring that White House reporters have a chance to ask as many questions as they need to. That's not to say it's always a smooth relationship, but it is certainly, we can talk about the adversarial relationship, but the comparisons between Trump's relationship with the media are probably most often made are to Richard Nixon. But what we're seeing again is that although Nixon had a very combative relationship with the media, and actually, there are quite a bit of efforts to kind of undermine. We think about the Pentagon Papers, for example, and efforts to suppress the publication of this secret history of the Vietnam War. But I would say that and I guess Yamiche was referring to this, the kind of the direct attack on the media and the undermining of the media, right, is unusual in American politics. So I would say we've seen, if we go from the 18th century to the present, certainly seen efforts by presidents. You think of John Adams, right, to restrict the press, going back to the 18th century, World War I, wartime is a period of restricting, but undermining the media as an institution in American politics, I would say is was, if not unprecedented, certainly not practiced before.
Richard Nixon, as a comparison, I guess, how did the White House both expand and restrict access to journalists in the past, Jim?
Well, Nixon in some ways was more dangerous because the thing about Trump is he never kept it secret. I mean, I'm sure there'll be more stuff that comes out, but he pretty much made it clear how he felt. I think Meena is absolutely right that this was unprecedented attack on the media, saying they were enemies of the people. But Nixon, who knew how to run the government, knew how to play the government. And so I think he was much more sophisticated in his undercutting of the press. One example is when our Bob Greene, our famous investigative reporter, went after Nixon and his relationship to Bibi Rebozo, his friend down in South Florida. All of a sudden, Bob was being investigated, taxes were being investigated. So Nixon knew how to use the levers of power in a way that in some ways was more dangerous than even Trump was showing us. But it's a close contest.
So the tools that were used, Yamiche, the White House was challenged by the president making tweets at all hours, often criticizing the press and his own staff who refused to echo him at times. How did you keep up?
Well, it's interesting that you asked that question. And before I answer that question, I want to go back to something that Jim just said, because I think it's interesting. I've never covered, before President Trump, I'd never covered another president. And I had spent a lot of my time doing sort of street reporting. Much of what I did at Newsday, it was cops reporting. It was being in people's houses. It was being on the street, kind of talking to everyday people every single day. So when I got to the Trump White House, and started assessing what danger means, I think we're going to be assessing that for a long time. But I think as someone who's not a student of the entire Nixon presidency, I think we have to, in some ways, look at the fact that there are a lot of people who see President Trump as being possibly the most dangerous president in the history, because one, you had, of course, the siege at the Capitol, which I think is going to be probably the seminal part of his legacy, that there were people who died at the Capitol. An officer last night who was murdered after engaging with people that were poisoned, their minds poisoned by this lie that President Trump told about the election being rigged, that officer was murdered, and he was body lying in rest yesterday in the Capitol. We just have never seen anything like this in US history. This was a United States president trying to upend democracy itself. Add to that the fact that you have things like the family separation policy, which international organizations say was equated to torturing immigrants in this country, separating breastfeeding mothers from their babies who were still breastfeeding. I mean, horrible, horrible things that were frankly dangerous. So I think when we assess danger, I think we're going to have to, in some ways, really talk more about what is dangerous. It's true, I think, that President Trump was very, very open with what he thought. None of the things that he said, I think, were secretive. it was plain out there from the very beginning when he went down the escalator and called Mexicans rapists and criminals. We knew what he wanted to do. They talked about the zero tolerance policy and said that they were separating people from their children as a deterrent to try to make other immigrants not come. But I think we need to maybe marinate on the idea of dangerous, because there was a lot of danger and a lot of things that happened in the Trump presidency that I think we're just now starting to process. In terms of how I kept up with all of it, I have this Apple Watch that I wear. It's unhealthy, but it buzzes me awake
Unbranded.
most mornings. It used to buzz me awake. Every time the president tweeted, I literally physically got a buzz on my wrist, which I can tell you it's a lot of buzzing. But it was the way that I had to keep up with it, because I would wake up at 6:30 in the morning and I would have missed a whole news cycle because the president was tweeting at 5 o'clock in the morning. I remember when the president had COVID, I had to be woken up by a television producer at 1 a.m. because I fell asleep waiting for his results to come in. So it was just this constant grind of trying to make sure my phone was on at all times, that my watch was always buzzing, and that I was constantly checking Twitter and constantly watching TV and constantly, of course, calling sources to figure out what to expect. But a lot of times the sources that I was talking to, they were watching and reading the tweets just like me. So it was a wild 4 to 5 years.
And the coronavirus, which was only 1 year so far, has only compounded that issue. And back in March, almost a year from today, Trump had cut you off in the Rose Garden when you pressed him on how the federal government planned to get states medical equipment. He told you to be nice and not to be threatening. How did you deal with a sitting president being combative on national television?
Well, in some cases, I think many of you maybe saw a little bit of how I dealt with it, because those tense moments played out in front of millions and millions of people. And essentially the way that I handled it was I thought of all the people that needed a press in the middle, and that still need a press in the middle of a pandemic, to get answers for them. We were, especially in March and April, when some of the most heated exchanges happened, we were in the throes of a virus that was killing people, that was scaring the crap out of Americans all over this country. And in my mind, I didn't think, I need to push back for me. I thought, I need to keep trying to press and ask these questions, because there are so many people that are waiting to actually figure out the real answers. I think sometimes we have we have questions for the president that maybe can be hypothetical, or they can be highbrow. They can be, what's your message to the American people? But in the throes of the pandemic, it was, when are people going to get tests? How are people supposed to be dealing with this? Should people be going outside? Why are we so behind in testing? Are the governors going to get enough ventilators so that Americans won't die because they're waiting for a ventilator? Those are the questions that were life and death questions. So for me, I had to be so focused on those, and so focused on thinking about so many people in this country that were looking and not thinking of this as entertainment or as some sort of highbrow exchange. They were thinking, how does this impact my daily life? And in some ways, I credit my time at Newsday for that, because I interacted with so many everyday working class Americans who I knew were watching these press conferences, trying to get real information, like, when am I going to be able to send my kid back to school? And the president didn't have answers for that. And he was lashing out at me because he was angry that he didn't have some answers for that. I think we will tell the story, I think, and the story will continue to be told about his lack of response to the virus, and the fact that he thought it was a hoax, and he downplayed it over and over again. And to Jim's point, it was very obvious what he was doing. But in some ways, it's still, I think, stunning that an American president in the middle of a pandemic just was not concerned about it for the vast majority of his time in office.
I think you might have just struck a chord with a lot of the Long Island journalists on the call. So a collective pat on the back, I think, there. But Meena, the combativeness and odd behavior that we're seeing, that means that the White House was inconsistent with its messaging and direction. What's the damage of that on public policy?
Well, JD, that's the damage is lasting, because if people don't have confidence in information and in institutions, then it makes it very difficult to build public support for policies. I was looking up yesterday, the Gallup poll does ratings on American confidence in institutions, right? And from last summer, if you looked at where the public stood on great deal or quite a lot, the presidency as an institution was at about 40%. Supreme Court was 40%. Congress was 13%. Military and small businesses were at 75%. Newspapers were at 24%. And TV news was 18%. So if we put those together, right, you're still at about 42%. That's a problem. I could just say also, just on a note of someone who teaches about the presidency and politics, I'm finding it increasingly a challenge to find common sources of information. It seems kind of, I guess, very old school, but when I was in college in the 80s, right, in journalism programs, it was pretty typical, I think, to say you read 2 daily newspapers, at least 1 weekly magazine, right? At least, at a minimum, as a foundation. Now, people tend to, as we talk about polarization in politics, that people kind of sort with the news sources that they want to hear, that they stay within their bubbles. What that means is there's less of a willingness to engage with inconvenient facts, right? Or information that contradicts what you believe. And as a result, then when you need to build for elected officials, when they need to build coalitions, right, and build public support to negotiate with Congress, if the public doesn't have confidence or doesn't believe the information, the policy process is stymied. So I think it's a big problem. I know that we've seen, of course, I think there were more than 16,000 fact checks on President Trump as of, I think, the spring of 2020, or maybe over the course of the presidency, it was like 30,000, right? Because in 2020, it was almost half of the total.
Looks like 37,000, someone from the audience is saying.
Yeah, I looked it up in the Washington Post, and I had 30,573. Right. So at any rate, it's a lot, right? And we're talking tens of thousands here, and about half of them were in the last year of the Trump presidency. So the point being, there are numerous fact-checking websites. Information is there, and I'm seeing some of the questions that have come up in the chat about the coverage of the 2016 campaign. If you go back and look at the news coverage, right? The New York Times ran stories about Trump's taxes. There were numerous stories. The reporting was there. There was a question of what people were choosing to listen to. And I think that's a big problem. That's not to say, I'm sure things probably could have been done better. Institutions, right? They have learning curves. But I think, your question, JD, was about policy. And the problem here is if people don't agree on information, right? If they don't agree on a problem, if there's even a problem or evidence of a problem, right? Then how, and you're thinking about questions like race relations or criminal justice, let alone response to the pandemic, right? How do you build policy?
So still on topic here, but Jim, I want to curve everything that Meena just said into those 3 items I mentioned earlier: controlling the 24-hour news cycle, social media, and the power of misinformation. All of that information coming to our audience, really. How have those factors played off of each other in previous administrations that might have been able to inform what had happened over the last 4 years?
Well, first of all, you have to understand how dramatically the effect of social media and the internet has been on covering the White House. When I covered the Carter administration in the first 4 years of Ronald Reagan, we were through by 6 o'clock at night. We'd get on lid, and we knew it was over, and you could cover the White House.
How does that sound? Pretty good, right?
Yeah. It's unheard of now.
I can't
believe also, the president needed you as the White House reporter. They had to get their message through. It's very important to get your message through. Joyce Kumar has written a book about the president trying to get his message through and how organized I had to be. So for all of the genius of Trump in manipulating the press, the White House operation was quite chaotic. But go back to my first point, you had a change by the time of Bill Clinton, when cable news had become dominant. The news cycle was 24/7. And the Times, for instance, went to having 3 or 4 people cover the White House, giving one person a chance to go do more in-depth stories while the other people covered the daily stories. And there's also the fact that, I think Obama was the first president to really do this. He was able to use the internet to go over the press's head. He didn't need the press. He could get his message out.
Right. And now, Yamiche, aside from being home for dinner in that analysis. How did Jim's experience check out with your work every day now under Biden? I mean, you've gotten to see and test the new relationship under Biden's press officer. Has it been that return to normalcy that was put in the beginning?
Well, I have to ask Jim, did they ever break the lid? Did you ever have a lid and then have to wake up and run back to the White House several hours after the lid had been called?
Oh, yeah, that happened all the time.
Okay.
Not all the time, but it happened periodically when there's a big storm. I mean, I remember getting a call at 2 a.m. saying there's a White House, they've sent a rescue team to Iran. And we had no sense that it was about to happen. And arriving at the White House, or during Jimmy Carter's year, my parents were visiting me. I lived out in Maryland, and my mother came running, and I was out playing tennis with my son. It was a Saturday afternoon, and the White House called. Jody Powell called my house to say Jimmy Carter is going to have a big announcement to make. He was shaking up his whole cabinet, and I had to go running in. I just had time to put a pair of pants on and my tennis shorts off and run in, and it was a couple of weeks of chaos there. So presidents were always ran into trouble with the press, and you always had this love-hate relationship. But there's nothing, in the end, I think that I told my students this, there's nothing to compare with Trump. There's nothing like that before. You had a malignant narcissist as president, and you had to see everything through that light. He saw everything and how it affected him, not how it affected anybody else.
Yeah.
Well,
So I was going to say, JD, sorry, I was just going to say what Jim is describing is in some ways what we experienced on a daily, hourly basis, right? So I remember when I first got into politics, I was, again, a reporter, kind of a national breaking news reporter. After I left Newsday, I went to USA Today and then to the New York Times. And I had covered hurricanes on Long Island and other places. And I thought, okay, I get into politics. They have schedules. We know what's going on. This is going to be so easy. And covering President Trump was like a hurricane every day, right? It was like every single day you didn't know what house was going to get blown up. You didn't know who was going to come out of the revolving door that became the White House staff. The chief of staffs were leaving. The attorney general was getting fired. The FBI director, I remember James Comey when he got fired. The Los Angeles Times, the TV stations there, they had to bring out their choppers. It was like watching OJ all over again. I mean, that's what we were dealing with. We were dealing with a constant wave of news. And the lucky thing for me was I had never covered another president. So all I had done was breaking news. All I had done was crazy storms, mass shootings, hurricanes, just completely upending your day every single day. Ever since I make an engagement with anybody, including having a date with my husband, I say, this is all based on whether or not there's news that's breaking. Luckily, my husband's a journalist, so he understands, but that's my disclaimer with every single event or anything that I do. And with Trump, it was like people understood immediately. If I had anything to do with anybody that had a day and time on it, everyone knew that it was a kind of penciled in arrangement, because every White House reporter's schedule was pretty much shot, because you never knew when news was going to be breaking and how it was going to be happening. So one funny story, my husband and I got engaged the weekend of the Access Hollywood tape. And the only reason why we got engaged that weekend was because I'd been following around Trump for a while and ended up in Pennsylvania. At the time we were long distance. He was working in Cleveland. And I ended up, you get to a point in Pennsylvania where you're basically in Ohio. So we ended up being together that weekend because my unpredictable schedule and running around with the president and his hundreds of rallies all the time, he and my husband ended up proposing that weekend. Of course, he didn't think twice about asking me to be his wife on the weekend when every woman in America was looking at men thinking, is this locker room talk to you? But luckily my husband did not think it was locker room talk. But that to me was my experience. I sympathize with Jim when he's talking about having just a couple minutes to throw on his pants to go to the White House. That's what I was doing. I had a go bag like I was covering a hurricane every single time I was at the White House. So I had all sorts of things to be ready to be on camera at all times because you just never knew what was going to happen.
New to her post is Press Secretary Jen Psaki, and she's told reporters, maybe in the same meeting with you, that she wants to restore tradition to the White House. She takes questions from reporters basically every day, and she comes with experience in this matter. She was a spokesperson under in the State Department for John Kerry, and then under Obama. She says that she wants to rebuild trust in the American people, and that she doesn't want to give extreme right media a bigger platform. Have you been seeing a shift in how certain outlets are getting attention?
Yeah, I mean, I think we are back to tradition again, because I've only covered one president. I didn't really understand what tradition was. I spent a lot of time talking to Peter Baker or with Judy Woodruff, asking them, hey, is this normal? Is this what's supposed to be happening? That was what I did for the last 4 years, was basically call those two people. I should have called Jim to ask him, what is this normal? Is this how things go? So it was news to me that a daily briefing really meant a daily briefing. I think I had thought that meant that it was going to be pretty often, but the fact that Jen Psaki has brought back kind of talking to traditional news outlets. She's also welcomed going around the room. So my seat is the farthest seat in the back. If you ever watch the press briefings, I'm the one all the way at the back in the corner. And she gets to me every single time that there's a press briefing, which I really appreciate. Let's remember that there was a press secretary under President Trump, Stephanie Grisham, who literally never held a press briefing, like not once. So, it's good to be able to go back and have times to really interact with this White House. And I think there's a level of respect there, mutual level of respect. She's not attacking people. She's not targeting people. Even if, there's tension there. There's always going to be tension between the president and the media, but it's just not the same thing. To Meena's point, talking about the idea of truth, we had the two tenets that I think describe the Trump presidency best are alternative facts. And when his personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, said on the Meet the Press that I was on one morning, truth isn't truth. Those two statements, truth isn't truth, and alternative facts, those two things define the Trump presidency and his relationship with information and the truth. And that is that he made up his own information and he convinced millions of people to only believe him.
Meena, from a public policy standpoint, what more can be done in the interest of transparency and access for the public and for the press?
It's interesting, JD. When I was kind of making some notes for this, I had my last bullet point here was reforms for White House media relations, and I left that as a big question mark because I think, I think this is the operation has become so coordinated and structured, particularly since the creation of the White House Office of Communications, the daily press briefings. We've been discussing how the last 4 years broke with a number of those practices. And social media has certainly, I think, exacerbated the challenges of the 24-hour news cycle. But as far as kind of specific reforms, I think it seems to me that the bigger challenge, it's less the White House and the media. It's how do you build information literacy? The phrase was just referred to, alternative facts, which Kellyanne Conway had said, right? The other one, of course, was fake news, right? And this has become something that people just say now, right? And how do you find a common platform of knowledge? And we know that there are educate programs. I know the journalism school at Stony Brook has started this, right, an information literacy program. And I think it's essential that we find a way to build an understanding of the importance of knowledge, right? And you hear a lot of discussion of talk about civics education, but what would that entail if we had that? I think we need to build programming more in the educational level, I would say, than at the White House level right now to build support for policymaking.
We've gotten a very interesting reaction now. It's been almost 12 years, 13 years,
Yeah.
that Dean Howard Schneider, who used to be the editor of Newsday, came up with the idea of news literacy, the idea of teaching what makes a story, what are the ramifications, what questions do you have to ask, that you shouldn't just depend on one source, what is cognitive dissonance, what is confirmation bias. It's a terrific course, and Howard's now head of that effort at Stony Brook, and he's working with a lot of Long Island school districts to try to bring the news literacy program into at least the junior high school level and the high school level. And there's one school in Brooklyn where the principal has, at an elementary school level, has the kids doing news literacy. And it's really amazing how they can evaluate a story.
Learning young. We're going to now move on to your questions for the panel. Peter Goodman wrote earlier, what are likely to be the long-lasting effects of the Trump period? Peter, who would you like to ask that to? Let's let Jim take this. He's got Carter and Reagan under his belt.
I remember about 3.5 years ago when my friend Jim LaRocca, who had run for governor once, called me and expressed the dire feeling that Trump has so had the press around his finger, he could manipulate us so much that everything was lost. And I said to him, just wait over time. It's day after day. The press comes out day after day. It's like a slow drip, 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 drip. But it gets through the people over time. People saw that this wasn't right, that he was not acting the way you expect the president to act. And the fact was he won by what, 7.5 million votes. And I think the press of the democratic institutions, I think the press can be fairly proud of itself for the job it did in bringing out the terrible aspects of the Trump presidency.
Peter, thank you for the question. Nice to see you. I think, there's so many tiers of effects, I would say. I mean, the policy effects, right? We're seeing with the slew of executive actions in the past 2 weeks, right? Some things are immediate, rejoining the Paris Climate Accord, creating a task force on immigration, but these are not easy changes, right? And immigration in particular, right? Highly contentious issue. We haven't seen serious immigration reform since 1986, right? With the Immigration Reform and Control Act. Clinton did the 1996 law, which was actually a little more restrictive, but we haven't seen a DACA, right? But that was an executive order, and then DAPA was an executive action. So I guess the policy effects, I would certainly say, are significant. We haven't even gotten into foreign policy. As far as the press, the news relationship, I think, again, I guess, and this gets back to JD's question, what kind of reform would be needed? If you could have I think having more structured press conferences with the president, certainly it's not possible to do it in the same way that you do with the White House press secretary, with the communications team, and Biden has put together an excellent team. But I think one thing that what we're seeing maybe at a repercussion or result of the Trump presidency is that there is really the media have to, the president's respect for the media, right, needs to be recognized. Right. And I think that's important. Sean Spicer said, I had read something about this, that he didn't think it was good for democracy that they were branding an entire industry as an enemy, but it appeared to be effective, right? And that's a problem. So I think to counter that, we need, and so Peter, I would say that is something that will take time, and it requires a strategic approach from the White House. Right. Doesn't mean that they're going to agree with the media, but again, kind of what Yamiche was describing with the press conferences, the questions, and I think the president himself directly being engaging with the press is essential for rebuilding.
I'm more interested in how the press is going to respond, because they're going to be different presidents.
Peter,
go ahead.
Peter, it's interesting that you say that. Alora Lagarde is with us, and she's a senior journalism student at Ithaca who grew up in Sag Harbor here on Long Island. And I think she has the same question that you're about to ask for Yamiche. Alora, can you ask your question?
my question kind of involved this lack of trust that we've had in the Trump administration, that people have had since the Trump administration 4 years ago, from these past 4 years. And my question goes into, if people believe journalism less and less, but watch more and get more and more hateful because of it, what is our role as future journalists in this system?
Yamiche?
It's a great question. I think the role of journalism has been the same, and it's just become more in focus in the Trump era and the post-Trump era. And that is your job, your role is to go out and tell stories and be fair and be accurate and talk to people about the issues that are impacting their lives. And if you're a White House correspondent, it's getting as much information as you can about what's going on at the White House, what the policies are, and how they're going to impact people's lives. If you're a reporter like I was at Newsday covering the Nassau County police or covering the Suffolk police, it's to go out and try to tell good stories about the police and how they're impacting the community. It's really just about making sure that you're telling the best stories that you possibly can. And I think leaving this trust in the journalism and whether or not people believe what you're saying, leave that to the people to decide. I don't concern myself very much with, oh, do people really believe my reporting, or do people think that I'm being that they trust the reporters. I just can't bother with that, because I think it would throw me off on my actual goal, which is to tell good stories and to be as fair as I possibly can be. I think that reporters were human beings. Judy says this all the time as an anchor at PBS NewsHour. We're human beings. Of course, there are going to be times where we're going to have opinions about stuff. There are times where we're going to have ideas about how something should be done. And your job as a reporter is to try to work against your own bias, to try to at least be as clear and fair as possible, because we're all doing this job with our biases, and with our experiences and how we grew up and where we live. There are just so many different things that influence how you see the world, including, of course, race and ethnicity. That you should just be so focused on doing the work, that you're not worried about the polls that say, okay, here's who trusts us. I think I love working at PBS. PBS is one of the most trusted sources of news in the country. But I have to tell you, I don't sit around thinking, okay, people trust PBS. How am I going to make them trust us more? I don't think about that. I think, let me go do my work and let the cards fall where they may.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. The other perspective I give it is, we're always being told that we're not objective. You can't be objective. You're a human being. And I say, my goal isn't to be objective. It's to be fair. I'm glad Yamiche was using that. The fairness. And it's fair to what? It's fair to the facts. That's our job. And is there bias in journalism? Of course there is. In fact, one of the things that worries me is that in trying to deal with Trump and his extreme detachment from the truth, it's led us to go beyond being fair at times and be very judgmental. And I think that's a problem that we need to be aware of, that it's not our job to give our personal judgment, but it's also our job to call a lie a lie. So it's a very fine line between being fair and being partisan.
And there's a job to do.
Yeah,
I just want to.
I was going to say just quickly, Jim's point is such a good one. It's a fine line, and I think for myself, going back to Alora's really great question, I also think there are so many times covering President Trump, I thought to myself, how would I want my grandkids to see this? How would I want people 20 years from now to judge my reporting? Not, do I think that those people think that they're going to like me, or do they trust me? It's, how am I going to also judge myself in these moments? So there were moments where, if the president sent out a tweet that told congresswomen who were born in this country to go back to their countries, I felt completely okay as a journalist saying that's a racist tweet. It's racist to attack people and to say that because they are a certain color that they somehow weren't born in this country. But I think it's a fine line, because you don't start then attacking people and saying, well, this is what I think about every single politician's ideas. But I think it's a really, really fine line. But it's, I think, one that we have to walk. And to be fair, I think sometimes is to be tough, and it's to be uncomfortable, to make people uncomfortable, frankly. But I think looking back at my coverage of President Trump, I stand by everything. I stand by the times where I said, okay, that was misinformation or disinformation. I stand by times where I called it a lie. And I stand by times where I said what he just wrote right there, that's racist. I never called him a racist per se, but I said this, telling someone that they are a thug because they're African American and live in Baltimore, we can say objectively that that's a racist thing.
There's a question I'd like to ask the audience, see what their feeling is about the fact that the social media organizations have put on limits, which they're certainly entitled to do. They're private companies, but I'm very wary of it. I think it's a very slippery slope when you start to decide what you're going to put on, what you're not going to put on. And you could see that working against someone going after people who are on the left and limiting what they can say. And I think in the end, we're better off letting everything out and exposing it to the sunlight and let people make a judgment, as difficult as that can seem.
Well, does anybody want to step up? Does anyone feel like have any thoughts about social media limiting others? I see Peter has his hand up. Peter,
yeah, I thought it had a very powerful effect in the fact that Trump was not able, he wasn't able to control the conversation because he couldn't tweet all the time, and it limited his access. And as a result, I think there was that there was actually a lowering of the temperature, a gradual calming, because we didn't have this guy sticking his oar in every 5 minutes to say something provocative and to get somebody upset. He couldn't.
Wound up with January 6th.
That was something that had been building up for a long, long time. You know, I mean, he'd been doing that for a long time, and the people had been planning for it. I mean, as we look at the stories that have come out, people have been planning to do that for months. And they were talking to one another. They weren't talking to him. They were conversing among themselves about what they were going to do and how they were going to do it.
I mean, I would just say, I was just going to say quickly, because the question, I think Jim's raising a really important point, and it's certainly not something to take lightly to restrict someone's access, right? But I think there was, after the attack on the Capitol on January 6th, that was unlike anything this country had seen since the early 19th century, right? When we were at war with Great Britain. And I think Peter's point is a good one, that we've certainly seen there's kind of been a calmness, right? I don't know, Yamiche, I don't know if you can put away your watch right now, but still, it's still, there is a little bit more structure and predictability, and those are building blocks for making progress, right? For governance. Again, it doesn't mean a smooth relationship, but it certainly means a more productive one, I would say. And I think that was the question that Melissa, who's a Hofstra grad, so hi Melissa, asked about whether the Trump President Trump kind of bypassing the media. I should just, with tweets that would kind of end up taking up the news story, I should just say though, Trump was not the first president to do that. I mean, we started to see Bill Clinton, right, was kind of started this direct connection with the people, bypassing the national media to do more state, local trips, right? Engaging directly. Social media has provided an opportunity for elected officials, creates an opportunity for elected officials to bypass the mainstream media and get directly to the people. And I think that has costs and benefits. So the Trump presidency kind of used that in ways that were sought to undermine institutions, but can also, I think, be used to complement institutional processes.
PCLI board member David North is with us. David, you have a question?
I had to unmute myself. The idea of the president or people who have disinformation to place on social media has me thinking about analogies. Professor Klurfeld, if someone was submitting letters to Newsday, a private entity is not obligated to print those letters. So is that analogous to social media, privately held? FDR could have had fireside chats because they're on the public airwaves. So I know Newsday had a set of standards before they would publish a letter to the editor. How does that compare to a social media post?
Well, I've thought about that many times as I've tried to deal with how slippery the slope is, because there were times when I had a dispute, for instance, with the Police Benevolent Association in Nassau County, and they wrote a letter to Newsday that was totally lacking in facts. And so we said we wouldn't print the letter unless you could correct the facts. So then they submitted an op-ed piece, which was just as bad. And so we said, rewrite it, we'll print it, but you make legitimate points. Your facts are wrong. So they then went to the advertising department and took out a full-page ad. And of course, the advertising people sent it over to me to check it over. And I said, this is unacceptable. This is not accurate. And so the PBA had, he never wanted to play golf with me again.
Facebook and Twitter would have the same obligation as you to seek the truth, and they're under no compulsion to print or publish.
No, they're not under any compulsion. I just think you have to be careful, especially when you have monopoly power the way they do. Facebook so dominates the field, and Twitter, that if there were more outlets, I'd feel better about it.
Would anyone on the panel have something to say about regulating, similar to the FCC, regulating social media? Any panelist with an opinion? Yamiche, I know as a broadcaster, you might have considered that.
I am not in the business of giving my opinion about this.
No, she just covers the facts. Come on, you've been watching this. Leah Chipino is in the audience, and she is a junior journalism and political science major. Leah, where do you go to school?
I go to Hofstra.
Hi,
Okay.
Leah. Nice to see you.
Hi.
Nice to
Leah
meet
was in my
you.
class last semester, star
Ah.
student.
Leah, do you have a question for Yamiche?
Yeah, my question is just when you were covering Trump, and I'm not trying to get you to divulge off the record conversations or anything, but if you interviewed him off camera or his staff off camera, if they were less combative. And I ask because I wonder if I think a lot of the distrust in the media comes from the fact that he just wants ratings. And so if he was less combative, and if that was just printed in print, if people would trust that more.
The president was pretty combative, without divulging too much. He was he was consistently combative, consistently hostile to the media, consistently feeling like he was the victim of some sort of effort to undermine his entire presidency. So yeah, the White House staff was not as combative. I had good sources who treated me with respect in the Trump White House, for sure. People who talked to me and gave me information. But the president himself, most of the time that I talked to him, it was a tense exchange. I will say that the president has smiled at me. He has waved at me. He has looked happy to see me when I've gone into press conferences, because I think there is a bit of liking the back and forth, liking the fact that he had kind of some reporters that he thought he could really beat up on and make some news on. I remember once there was a reporting of the president that was made public where he said, I have some of my hitters in there, and he was pointing to different reporters because he was like, oh, those are some of my favorite reporters to beat up on. So I think I became probably someone who he liked to beat up on. And I think in some ways, I got the sense at the end of the Trump presidency, when it was clear that he had lost the election, I got the sense that he might miss beating up on us a bit. But he was, again, consistently angry at most of the questions, because maybe people aren't familiar, but before I covered President Trump in 2016, I covered Bernie Sanders, and maybe there are some Bernie fans. You might remember that Bernie Sanders didn't really like me. Because again, I was someone who I asked a lot of questions. I asked probing questions like, why are there not a lot of African Americans on your staff? Why do you think that your rallies are overwhelmingly white, even when we go to overwhelmingly African American cities? It became the thing that, of course, made him lose the election and the primary twice, in 2016 and 2020. So it was the question of the Bernie campaign. and I was someone who consistently was getting at that issue, and he did not really appreciate that. So I think I will say I'm someone who got used to politicians in particular getting frustrated with me, and I think that will be the same way, frankly, with the Biden administration. Obviously, like I said, there was a mutual respect, and I think Bernie had a mutual respect for me. He never called me threatening or said I was nasty. But I think that the tension will always be there.
It's interesting to know how much it's changed. I tend to take a close look at Franklin Roosevelt and his relationship with the White House press corps. On his first day in office, he called the White House press corps in. I was much smaller then. They could all fit around his desk. And he said, I'm going to try something. Everybody tells me this won't work, but we're going to give it a try. I'll meet with you twice a week, and I'll answer your questions, but it all has to be off the record. You can only quote me if you get permission from my press secretary early. He had the White House press corps eating out of his hand. But he also was pretty straight with them and made it clear when he didn't want to answer. And he was a master manipulator. But we've gone from that to Trump. I mean, those are the two. That's where the relationship between the press and the White House has gone, from the cooperative relationship with Roosevelt, who this was before television. Yamiche, when I first covered the White House, many of the briefings, the early morning briefings, were off the record. They weren't you couldn't use cameras on them. And once cameras became ubiquitous in all the press meetings, they became much less useful for me as a reporter. Now, I know you needed pictures. But
it is very interesting that you say that, though, because I definitely get this sense that obviously on camera, you're getting different information when you can talk to people behind closed doors at their desks when they're eating lunch. You just get different kind of information and a different level of access.
I was curious, Yamiche, about your, despite having this craziness going on with the president, how about establishing those? I was wondering about your established relationships behind the scenes with sources, and what kind of relationships you established with your sources in the White House. What kind of, traditional kind of sources and relationships did you have that you could count on for news, information, that kind of thing? How was that?
I had a pretty good number of sources in the Trump White House. People who would call me back. I hinted this before. I think there were people who definitely respected me, people who definitely would talk to me off the record or on background. I definitely had cabinet officials who would call me up and tell me different information. I had members of the COVID-19 task force that would tell me, here's how this meeting went. So I think overall, it was a good, back and forth and a good relationship, as good as it could be. I do say I know more people in the Biden White House, mainly because a lot of them are coming from the Obama White House or the Clinton White House. So it's an interesting thing to now be sourcing up with them. But I will say, on a staff level, apart from the president, the Trump White House overall was somewhat a respectable relationship with mutual kind of understanding that we were all human beings just trying to do our job.
Can I ask another question? About social media. I think a lot of us here have grown up, let's see, I'm 63. So a lot of us are used to reading the newspaper and getting our news from the TV news and all that pre-cable and so forth. But it seems to me that the revolution of social media seems like it's really changed everything. And it seems like, well, who's a journalist? It's like I taught school, and I ask my students, well, where do you get your news from? They get it from Twitter. They get their news from Twitter. They don't watch regular news. They don't read newspapers. Who are the journalists? I mean, what do you trust? How has social media changed journalism as we know it? And will it ever get back to the respectability that it kind of used to have? Or what's your opinion about that, Yamiche? James Klurfeld, what do you think about that?
I think that the social media has made it much more difficult for us. As I say, the outcome, though, in the historical perspective, I think the press will be seen as doing an important job against the Trump administration. And it's not dramatic. It's the type of reporting that Yamiche did every day. It just comes out as a steady drip of this is not accurate. This wasn't the case. His facts are wrong. It just builds over time.
Yamiche, what do you think about that? How has it changed? How has it changed since you've been a journalist? How has social media changed your understanding of what a journalist is supposed to do and how he's supposed to source his material and have, 2 and 3 sources as opposed to just getting it out there immediately and, not quoting anonymous sources and so forth? I mean, how's it changed in your opinion?
So for me, social media hasn't changed the tenets of journalism, which is that you should have at least 2 sources telling you information, that you should try to verify as much as possible the information before you put it out there. So I think the actual doing of journalism, because journalism, even the quick, fast Twitter journalism, still has to be the journalism that you feel comfortable putting your name behind. Because every single time I send out a tweet, or every single time you see a reporter breaking a story, even if it's on Twitter, they're putting their entire reputation and their name and their career on the line by sharing that information. I think that social media has made it so that we have a quicker way to disseminate information, and also a quicker way to gather information. We are often asking people on Twitter, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? It can be tough, of course, because social media isn't a reflection of America. There are so many people, working class Americans that don't have television sets, older Americans who maybe aren't on Twitter all the time, like my mom, who's not on Twitter. So many people that we need to, I think, sometimes really understand that Twitter is a very small subset of America. That said, I think there are other things that social media has done, and I think it's a really good thing, is it's in some ways replaced the role of an ombudsman. We used to have newspaper budgets and TV budgets for people who would work for news organizations, who would then go and look at news organizations with a critical eye and say, here's what we're doing wrong, here's what we're doing right, here's where we faltered. And a lot of those positions have been eliminated. What I like about Twitter, and I will say especially Black Twitter, you will hear back if something is wrong, or if there was something that was changed, or if there's something that is causing controversy. I think there are a lot of reporters who don't like that, who think they shouldn't have a kind of a peanut gallery to respond to. I think that it's a good thing, because at the end of the day, journalism should be a service. And I want to hear back from people if they think that the headline was wrong, or they think that I didn't properly write this story, or they think that this source is manipulating me, or that whatever it is that people think. Even if sometimes it's problematic and people say nasty things to me, I still think I want to hear people's voices, because it lets me understand what people are thinking. So I think those are all the different ways that social media has changed. I should say, I've never really practiced journalism without social media. I got to college and Facebook started the year that I started in college. So I never was doing the craft in an era where social media wasn't a part of it. Right. I remember writing my first stories on my iPhone. My iPhone #1, the first one I got. My editors thought I was crazy. They were like, "You're writing on a phone," and for me it was so normal, because I had been texting my friends for 4 years on a telephone, that when it came to writing a 500-word story, it was second nature to write it on my phone if I'm sitting down at a park bench. And I try to remind young journalists, lean into whatever it is. Like, now I'm the one who's like, TikTok, I don't know what TikTok is. I can't do TikTok. I'm not doing TikTok. And I already feel old, right? I'm like, in my 30s, I'm already like, there are medias coming out that I don't want anything to do with. But I think for people that are going to be 18, 19, 22, you're walking into a newsroom where, if you understand TikTok, there are journalists like me who are like, I don't understand that. So there are stories on there, story ideas, sources that you will get on using TikTok that I will never touch, because I'm not on TikTok. So I think that it's always to especially the young journalists' advantage to lean into the changing technology, and to make that your thing, make that your the thing that you're focused on, and how you're gathering sources.
Just quickly make the point that Barack Obama in his book makes the point any number of times that the social media was a very negative force, he felt, when he distorted what he was trying to do and undercut what he was trying to do. And he was very frustrated about how to handle the social media.
Folks, we're gonna wrap up with Olivia Winslow's question. Olivia.
Thank you. I want to make a couple of points. And I can recall when Yamiche was sent up to Washington when she was still at Newsday and she had to write some sort of story. I forget what it was about. And I said, well, how'd you do it? What? She said, I did it on my phone. Well, now I can do that too, Yamiche. I just... but to speak to Mr. McCulloch's point, when they say they got their news on Twitter, they're actually reading a news story often. So it's not like they just saw one tweet. I mean, I can tell you the Newsday Long Island Divided investigation of housing discrimination here on Long Island. When I went to the IRE convention last year, just as COVID was starting, by the way, in New Orleans, I found out a lot of people have read that story on Twitter, right? I mean, and so just to say, just because somebody says, I saw it on Twitter, well, you can read the actual story. I read a lot of stories on Twitter myself. And I'm as old as you are, Mr. McCulloch. So, but Yamiche, I wanted to ask you, you talked about the sources that you had in the Trump White House and dealing with people who treated you as a human being. I wondered, what was it like with Kayleigh McEnany? I mean, she seemed so combative towards the end there. What was, what kind of relationship did you have? Like Jim Klurfeld says, often the press secretaries represent their bosses, the president, and we know how combative the former president was. So what kind of relationship did you have with, I'm going to get all of their names, but Kayleigh McEnany, Sarah Huckabee Sanders.
Oh, Olivia, you're going to be here a long time if you're going down the list.
Well, I'll get at those two.
So one, I'm so happy that Olivia is here tonight. As soon as I saw her, I sent her a text saying, hi, Olivia, because I love Olivia. And she helped me get through Newsday and to understand how to be a journalist, right? Like, I remember sitting at your desk so many times, like Olivia was like on deadline and I was like, I have 12 questions I need you to answer right now. And I remember you're like, I still remember people who sat next to you being like, Yamiche's too loud. She's laughing too loud. Like, what is she doing in our area? Because I would have to go like 18 corners away to get to Olivia because her desk was all the way on the other side of the newsroom, but somehow I still found her regularly to go talk to her. So thank you, Olivia, for all of that and more.
I didn't do much.
And of course, she's talking about Long Island Divided. I'm sure all of you have now read it, but it's this amazing award-winning story about real estate and Long Island. And it's just, if you haven't read it, you have to. If you're a young journalist who are on here tonight, go read that story and look up Olivia. Go try to get her to talk to you because she can tell you about how much went into that story and that's service journalism, right? It's that story that tells you what's going on from a ground level. But to get to your question, I had assorted relationships with all of these press secretaries. With Sarah Huckabee Sanders, I think there was more respect there. I think she would call on me, and I think there was a real sense that even when she was not giving us the information that was true, that she wasn't being as combative. Kayleigh McEnany, I remember the first time I saw her, and she pledged that she wasn't going to lie to us. She was probably the most Trump-like press secretary because she really came out and was smooth and charismatic and really was polished. And you could tell was someone who President Trump would enjoy watching on TV. And it quickly became clear that she had the same kind of relationship with the truth that the president had, which was a very troubled one. She often did not tell the truth, often was singling out reporters, often was there to pick a fight. And of course, at the end of it, she was working both for the campaign, the Trump campaign and the Trump White House. And we didn't really know what her role is. It was a kind of fluid role where she would be on Fox News as a campaign spokesperson. Then when we would ask her a question at the White House about the campaign, she would refer the question to the campaign saying that she wasn't part of the campaign. So that was the kind of head-spinning relationship that I had with her. I never really understood at times what her job was at the end, what questions she could answer, what questions she couldn't. So it was a tough relationship. It was a tense relationship because we wanted answers and she wasn't giving them.
Thank you.
Well, folks, thanks so much for your questions, and thank you to our panel. Yamiche Alcindor is the White House correspondent for PBS NewsHour. Professor Meena Bose is the director for the Peter S. Kalikow Center for the Study of the American Presidency at Hofstra University, and Professor Jim Klurfeld taught journalism at Stony Brook University and was a longtime editor at Newsday. A recording of today's panel will be available at pcli.org. And anybody from the PCLI board have anything to add? Maybe another note about our upcoming awards, Scott?
Yeah, just tonight. Well, we'll keep talking about the awards. So yeah, well, again, thanks everybody for coming. It was a great conversation. I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot. And yes, please enter our awards. I should note that the proceeds from the awards goes to our scholarship fund. So it's about supporting young journalists, journalists in school. And they go to Long Island journalism students. So places like Stony Brook, places like Hofstra, these are the places where, our students go, and that's where the money goes towards. So please enter. That's how we support it. And yeah, thanks. And thank you, JD. You did a great job. You're born for radio.
I get all beat red in the face. That's why I meant for radio, right? I'm really passionate about these issues. But Yamiche, Meena, Jim, thanks so much for joining us, and
Thanks
thank
for
you all.
asking us.
Thanks. Really enjoyed this.
So much.
Thank you.
For being here. I think there were some chats that were directed specifically at you guys. If you guys just want to pan through them real quick, if there's anything that was hanging out there that you wanted to address, but if not, I think we're all set.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you again for inviting me tonight. Like I said, I have a special place in my heart for Long Island, and especially Bill Blyer. Whatever Bill asked me to do, I'm going to do, because we're old friends. And I'm so excited to see Bill and Olivia here. So I'm just really, really happy to be with you all tonight. And I learned so much from listening to Jim and Meena. I really appreciate you all.
Come on, you haven't been
one
away from
PS
Long Island
is,
that long.
We were supposed to be hosting the SPJ Regional Conference last year, and at Hofstra with Yamiche as the keynoter, and we got blown out by the virus. But we're hoping to resurrect that conference at Hofstra in 2022, and we're hoping Yamiche will still be the keynoter. So.
Awesome.
And Yamiche, you haven't been away from Long Island for too long. You got to say in all one word, Long Island. Come on.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. I'm going to end the session now, and everybody have a good night.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Very
you.
nice. Very nice.